Hi everybody, this is the second episode of the Western Bet podcast with Miss Sheehan, and I have got my second guest on. So we've really brilliantly got Miss Shea in this week, and she's chosen another cracking text, and actually one that's probably really suitable for our current times. It is George Orwell's 1984, which I'm sure a lot of you have read, and if not, please do. To start with, Miss Shea, could you please tell us why you chose it?
Yes, I'm sure, as you say, a lot of people will have read this and will be way more kind of expert in many of the aspects to it. But I will try and talk about it from sort of my personal perspectives. So for me, really, I read it probably when I was about 16, I think, and I think I probably had to do it for a GCSE text, and would have and I would have sort of sighed at the thought. And then annoyingly, I got really into it. So I couldn't be angry about it. I got really into it because a lot of the things that I was reading, and particularly some of the really famous terms like Big Brother and Room 101, I hadn't realised when I'd heard them sort of on the news and people talking and using those words. I had never realised that they were from 1984, the book.
I think that's so common with literature. Like Shakespeare's created, we think, something like 1,700 words and phrases, and you wouldn't at all know it in how often they're used. And Big Brother and Newspeak and Room 101, like you said, are actually terms that people chuck around quite a lot, that tons of people don't know where they come from and think they were kind of coined by news presenters almost.
Yeah, I literally thought that Room 101 was a TV show.
It does sound like one.
And then I watched it, and so I read it, and suddenly it kind of had this whole new meaning, and I felt like I understood it a bit more than I had before. I think also for me, 1984, I was born in 1983, so reading it, knowing that it had been written way earlier, about the year 1984, even though it was still felt so relevant. And I could still relate to it so much about society in, say, sort of late 1990s, early 2000s. That I found just kind of quite strange. It made me sort of think that George Orwell must have been almost sort of quite clever, a bit spooky, that he was able to almost predict things that hadn't quite happened but felt like they could at any point.
It's funny, isn't it? Because I think there are a lot of dystopian type fictions like that, where at the time they probably seemed absurd and like these really distorted nightmares, but actually they've kind of come to form some form of reality. I think particularly with 1984, because it's an issue of surveillance, which with our developing technological capacities is more relevant than ever, isn't it? And do you think that we're right to be afraid of it? Do you think that Big Brother scope is something to be wary of?
I personally think that has quite a lot to do with your a bit of a broader statement, kind of your perspective on anything. We can always look at technology from a negative point of view, and I think we like to see the negatives in things, just as humans. But I also think we do. We almost, if you get a piece of work back, you could have 100 pieces of positive feedback, and you focus on the one negative piece of feedback. And I think that's a bit the same with the idea of surveillance. It can feel increasingly like we are being sort of followed whenever you go on a website and you have to click for you agree or disagree to have the cookies on the website. But I think that that can be, I think it's how you perceive it. I think surveillance could be used both negatively and positively. I think nowadays maybe less, for me it's less the fear of maybe individual governments and surveillance from that perspective, and perhaps more as what feels a bit more subtle, I don't know if it is, but of global organizations and their surveillance.
Almost like the big
perhaps.
companies
So
like
things,
Google and Apple, and how what
yeah.
data they have and they own of you.
And I mean, you can go and look at probably numerous different TED Talks about this, but I always remember seeing one, I think it's only about 8 years old, and it just showed you two different people's Google searches.
Oh gosh.
But they put the exact same Google search in and into the search engine, but the results came back so differently because they were tailoring the results to the individual.
Gosh,
And I mean, that's
scary.
going back 8 years. So yeah, I think that's quite a I don't know if it's scary, but I think it's something to be aware of, I suppose.
It's scary
And
and
making,
fascinating, I suppose, isn't it, simultaneously?
yeah, I think so. I think, I suppose, should we fear surveillance? Partly because we don't really know what's surveilling us.
Yeah.
That's not a word.
Actually watching.
But yeah, who is it? I think there's a very there's a bit of a fearful kind of anonymity about it. Yeah, I would say that's
memes and jokes, isn't it? That I know a lot of my kind of older year 11s and things have looked at, is that idea of the FBI agent in your camera laptop. Like that whole joke that someone's right there watching you constantly. You're like, hey buddy, how are you?
Well, I think what I suppose it links a bit to one of the other things that I was thinking about in terms of sort of why, in terms of surveillance, is large scale and small scale. We have these huge kind of organizations like Amazon and Google, and that must have some data on us.
Yeah.
But then I think also with 1984, the reason I think it appeals to a lot of people is because you can relate it at sort of different scales. So when I was reading it, I remember thinking, oh, this isn't just about the state, this is about the individual sort of on my community next door who's also kind of, what are they watching me, are they checking if, I don't know, I let the dog off the lead when I shouldn't, and tiny things like that. But I don't know if we should fear the big scale surveillance as much as, do we trust each other?
Yeah, that's such a good point, actually, because I think people go very quickly to 1984 to look at totalitarian states of government and the dangers they pose. But actually, a lot of the novel is about those individual choices to be judgmental and to take action against others when it's not really your place to or your business to as well.
Yeah, and you get that sense throughout. I think kind of, I remember feeling all the time like, oh, should we trust this new character? Should we trust that one? And that sort of leaves you with that, you almost don't like yourself for feeling like that.
Yeah, it kind of touches a lot on the scope of human betrayal on a small scale, and how you can lose compassion quite quickly if you're paranoid.
Yeah.
Gosh, forget how dark this one is. Great choice.
Sorry.
It's good, I love it. I think as well, we were talking actually earlier prior to the podcast about the article by Professor Harari, who's the writer of the book *Sapiens*, who actually I know a lot of our staff have read, and it is a cracking read about the history of sort of human nature and humankind. And he's got an article we both were looking at, haven't we, about the privacy and health, and how these new track and trace apps that could be used with the virus almost present an issue of privacy and health as binaries of human rights. Do you think 1984 touches on that at all? And do you think that there's a message in what Orwell wrote for us for how we could take it now in 2020?
Yeah, I definitely think, I mean, there are so many messages in it, but I definitely think that is one of the one thing which shines out, doesn't it? That idea of the characters in it being feeling like they don't have their privacy, but that this is a good thing for them because they are being protected because of this, being watched by their television screens. Was a way that they could be safe. I certainly think that shines out. To me, it linked when we were thinking about that and the article. It seems that it links quite well to the different types of societies and how they've been tackling the coronavirus, I suppose, and just having friends who a friend who lives who lived in South Korea, and just speaking to her about her perspective of, I suppose, more of a collectivist society is what she would say. How the people there actually viewed viewed being told by the government how they should do things. There wasn't really a sense of kind of rebellion in that. It was very much, we were told to wear masks, we will.
Yeah, in that sense of, we have to trust that they're doing what's best for a collective community.
Yes, and we all will do that because that's what we do. Whereas I think in kind of more of the Western European, I suppose, potentially individualistic cultures where we place that much more emphasis on our kind of individual rights and freedom to have those rights. Sometimes if we're being told to do something, then it feels like it's an invasion of our rights, and I'm not always sure that is the case.
We just don't like being told what to do.
Yeah, in a way, because that's protecting what I think, right, in some ways rightly, is what we feel are, the basic rights that we have, and a right to our own freedoms. I don't think they have to be two ends of a spectrum, but I think they certainly are presented that way in 1984.
To make it the kind of perverse horror that it is, really, like it's not shocking if it's not that starkly contrasted, I suppose.
And absolutely. And I think that making health and privacy be so opposite ends of the extreme, it's very easy for the reader to see that that's actually all about the power and maintaining the power status so in the book, by the party, as it's called, like the totalitarian kind of group, they're the ones who are trying to maintain that power structure, and anything that gets in the way of that is removed.
Yeah, they're very clearly a kind of quite black and white villain, aren't they, in that regard, that it is about power, it is about control. Whereas I suppose what Harari's article looks at is, when do you know if it's corrupt control, and when do you know if it's something for your own good that you just don't like the sound of, like eating more vegetables?
Yeah. I think.
Okay, I have a horrible question for you now. Apologies. Room 101, you mentioned a few times earlier, and I think Room 101 is one of those really darkly fascinating parts of the novel, particularly when the characters are kind of knowing they're going to go in there and they don't know what to expect. It's that whole idea of personalized phobia, isn't it, for once? What would be in Room 101 for you?
God, that's such a horrible question, but a really good one. I think that is the part of the book that I most vividly kind of remember. I almost don't want to give it away, because it was such the way that it's described when he has to face his fear. The build up to it is worse than the actual event of it.
The creeping.
I'm putting off having to think of a really bad fear. I don't know. I think it's such a hard one. There's obviously kind of mortal embarrassment, which is different. Having to dance in front of a whole school of people would be pretty awful. But I think
we did in India.
There's that. But I would probably say I don't really like being in very, very, very crowded stadiums, to be honest. But I wouldn't. Maybe I've not been exposed to enough scary things, because I would still go there and do that. To be honest,
part of the horror of Room 101 is that you might think you know what's in there, and actually, like you said, the reality of what might really, really scare you haven't come across yet.
Yeah, I think it's almost the build up, and I think that's what the fear is, that that's why it becomes so scary, is because it's built up so much. within, yeah. So for me, I don't really like being in big crowded stadiums, but I wouldn't say that's quite that kind of same, is it sort of almost visceral fear and pain that you get from what he experiences in Room 101.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because actually I think when you ask people about Room 101, and then if you ask someone separately about a phobia, you probably wouldn't necessarily put the two together, because Room 101 has this really quite psychologically traumatic feel to it, whereas a phobia is quite oddly like, you'd be like, I just don't like spiders.
Yeah, and almost it's, I suppose, almost what's worse about Room 101 is that they're making him face it, and this horrendous, for him, this sort of like awful fear, and it's the fact that by doing that they are taking away a bit of who he is, and making him have to, I think that's almost what's worse about it, what makes it so more like just such a terrible event, is that almost by facing this fear, he is having to accept that that Big Brother have, shall we say, kind of got him and got to him.
Yeah, that's what makes it so dark, isn't it? You think primarily of the villain being the idea of the surveillance and the control, but actually the psychological trauma that they put him through on that scale kind of tips the whole book into a different realm of scary, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's almost, it's yeah, he's suddenly so it's so disheartening, isn't it? He's gotten to this point, and he's managed to keep some sort of sense of, I'm not going to let them kind of take over. I'm not going to succumb to this one power over me. And it's almost the point where he's sort of having to accept, actually, yeah, in order to survive this, I'm going to have to forgo my principles, I suppose.
It's funny how dystopian novels always touch on survival, though, don't they? That idea of what it means to survive, and how that's sometimes different to living with rights and living with moral. And there's a lot of that, I think, increasingly in teen fiction and young adult fiction, with series like The Hunger Games and Divergent being so unbelievably popular. And it's been a growing genre. Do you think that we're sort of almost in a weird dystopia now, aren't we? The pandemic, which doesn't feel real. Do you think that we'll see more dystopian fiction after the pandemic, or do you think we might have a change in what dominates literature?
Oh God, that's a really good question. I suspect it will be a bit of both. I think if you were to ask most people on different consecutive days, you'll have those times where you're sort of quite positive and really excited about coming out of lockdown, and then the other times when it feels like you've been in lockdown for so long that you kind of are sort of feeling a bit low, and like, the world, how can we possibly keep going? And I suspect that might be reflected in the different types of sort of films and television shows that come out after this. I think some people will be wanting just give me something lighthearted. Let me not have to think about it. But then there's that surprising number of people who've been watching films like Contagion at the same time. So it's almost like we're a bit of a kind of, we want to really feel it properly.
And attune to it. We're like, this is us now.
I'm quite looking forward to one of the shows that I came across that I've gone on about quite a lot recently, was the Black Mirror series. And that seems to, as I was thinking about things that we might want to talk about in relation to 1984, that one kept coming into my head, and how technology is having kind of its different impacts on the world. And I would like to sort of see a series in relation to how Black Mirror might be tackling coronavirus, and the way in which technology has been a force for good and a force for not so good in relation to it.
It's funny, isn't it, how you think through the ages there's dystopian fiction about certain types of particular issues, but for us, increasing, especially now because we're relying on it so much to work from home and being locked down, technology keeps reappearing as one that's either going to save the world or end the world, and it's a funny dichotomy, really.
Yeah, and I think again, I think that the as I'm sort of going through my head now and recalling the different episodes, I'm immediately drawn to the ones, or the ones that first spring to mind are the quite negative versions. So there's lots of different individual episodes in this series which all relate to how technology can be kind of used to manipulate society in a good way or a negative way. And all the ones I'm thinking about are the negative examples again. And actually, the reason I like this series is because it comes up with some actual really positive ways in which technology can be used for the betterment. Yeah, I think that's something that that when we're thinking of 1984, it's very much presenting again television's watching us in a really negative light, but there are a lot of positive things relating to technology.
So perhaps then my final question for you then could be that, is your kind of thoughts of the future, are they fearful of a kind of Big Brother 1984 like state, or do you think that actually the book is terrifying but highly unrealistic and not something to be scared of, really?
I think the book is terrifying and realistic. But again, I think it's one of those, you could be scared of everything, and I think the things that we should be scared of are probably those black swans that we haven't predicted. So I think it's a perception. You could spend your life being fearful of things that we know, fearful of things that we don't know, but actually, hopefully, we could try to reframe things and not focus our energies on the fear aspect of them.
No 1984, no Hunger Games here then. Let's just go with that.
That'll be fine. I think let's have happy films and
happy films.
Yeah.
This is a much nicer turn, bearing in mind we started with we're having 1984 today. So I think we've got to a really nice point to end and make everyone feel cheerful again.
Well, I think so. I think it's I think let's go and watch Disney films and feel happy.
Yeah, and we'll balance it by reading 1984 accordingly, and just make sure that we've got that lovely balance there. So I think it is time for us to go. I might have lost Miss Shea right at the end there anyway, actually. I do apologise. And well, huge thank you to her for coming on and talking about another kind of literary classic that I hope many of you can enjoy or have enjoyed. And we will do another one again next week. So every Friday you will have a new podcast, listening to your Western Bet staff talking about their favourite books and more than that, probably the world in general. Thank you again all. Take care.